Is ISIS regrouping in Iraq and Syria? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Five months after US-backed forces ousted the Islamic State from its last remaining territory in Syria, a new Pentagon report says the terrorist group is regaining some of its strength. And a recent United Nations report concluded that despite its military defeat in Syria and Iraq, ISIS leaders are, quote, adapting, consolidating and creating conditions for an eventual resurgence in both countries. To help us understand what it all means, we turn now to CGTN's White House correspondent Nathan King. And Nathan, let's look at the situation right now. US President Donald Trump, less than a year ago, declares victory over ISIS, reduces support for the Kurds, withdraws some US troops. Question is, did that US drawdown create some of the conditions that's allowing ISIS to regroup?
Yeah, it's worth emphasising, Anand, that ISIS is not of the strength that it once was. The caliphate that dominated parts of Syria and Iraq is no longer. Raqqa has been taken over. Mosul in Iraq has been expelled of ISIS. But essentially, the Pentagon report basically said what everyone was warning about when the US did draw down troops and also take its focus off ISIS, is that the support in some areas and the manpower would stay. Now, the estimates are between about 14 and 18,000 fighters. That doesn't, of course, take into account sympathetic civilian personnel, which, of course, is very, very important, spread across Iraq and Syria, some of the mountainous areas of Iraq, some of the desert areas of Syria, including refugee camps and camps set up to take ISIS members and sympathizers as the caliphate crumbled. So that is kind of the basis. And what we're seeing is low-level attacks. We're seeing kidnappings. We're seeing extortion. We're even seeing corruption in certain areas of Syria and Iraq. And I also should mention Afghanistan, the offshoot of ISIS there as well, between about 2,000 and 4,000, which could complicate any drawdown of US troops there, is also worth mentioning. The big question is what happens now. Do they try and reconstitute the caliphate in Raqqa or attack areas of northern and western Iraq? There has been indications that there are some sort of regrouping for efforts to do that in the next few months. As you know, the Iraqi security forces were overwhelmed back in 2014. Syria is in really no place to rebuff them if they're reconstituted, so that leaves open big questions. But we are not seeing the pull from the outside like we saw in 2014 and other stages, but there is remnants of a force that are regrouping. The question is it big enough to make a difference on the ground?
Nathan, there doesn't appear to be much of an appetite in the Trump administration to increase military operations. So what options does the US have left right now? What happens next?
Right. I mean, obviously, it's a very complicated situation. The US has drawn down the few thousand troops that it had in Syria. It's trying to get out of Afghanistan. It's trying to make the Iraqi forces stand on their own 2 feet. They really don't like being there. As you know, President Trump was elected on ending the wars that have lasted so long, especially in Afghanistan. But Syria he really has no appetite for, and Iraq either. A recommitment of troops would be a signal of failure from this White House. Essentially, the new Secretary of Defense here, Mark Esper, disowned his own Pentagon report into this. So the solution is not US troops. The big question is, what do? They try and do it with local forces like they did in Syria. Well, that could complicate an end to the ongoing civil war if you start to back the Kurds again and the Syrian autonomous forces, the rebel forces that did a good job on the ground as well. Do you back it with air power? Well, you know, that's intervention as well. What about Iraq? I mean, remember that the US did deals with Iranian-backed militias to root out ISIS in Mosul. They are not getting on with Iran right now. Afghanistan, do you deal with the Taliban to fight ISIS on the ground? That's going to be difficult as well. The problem is for the Trump administration is not going back in, but can it kind of step back and control events from afar? And history, as you know from the Obama administration, when they pulled out from Iraq, a lot of people here in Washington accused the Obama administration of creating a vacuum that ISIS essentially filled. Now, history doesn't always repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes, and with ISIS it could rhyme again.
Thanks, Nathan. That's CGTN's Nathan King reporting from the White House. There is much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Saeed Hussein Mousavian served on Iran's National Security Council and as the country's ambassador to Germany. He joins us from Princeton, New Jersey. With us from the United Nations is Majid Glee. He's a Kurdish journalist and political analyst with the Rudao Media Network. John Sitilides is a government affairs specialist and consultant to the U.S. State Department. And joining us from Ankara, Turkey, is Yusuf Alabada, a 23-year veteran of the Turkish military. He's currently an international security and political analyst. Thank you to everyone for joining us. Yusuf Alabada, let me start with you. There are two reports out, one from the United States Department of Defense, otherwise known as the Pentagon, and the other from the United Nations, both concluding that ISIS is rebuilding in Syria as well as in Iraq. Now, you have traveled to Aleppo, you've traveled to Idlib in Syria. What is your assessment?
Okay. As we know that ISIL was controlling a large territory as big as the Britain, and it is definitely has been defeated in terms of militarily as a country. But I can say that ISIL is transforming itself to a terrorist organization which is controlling a huge land to an underground terrorist organization. Now we can see that they are controlling $400 million and they have invested business inside Syria, Iraq, and in many other parts of the world. For this reason that ISIL has been defeated militarily as a state, as a so-called state, but I can say that ISIL is also consolidating its power at the underground, and I also want to assure you that they are threatening all the people inside the Syria and especially in the northern part of the Iraq. So especially the people of the Nineveh, Salahaddin, Kirkuk, northern part of the Iraq, the people can feel the ISIL threat very closely because they threat people not to be a policeman, not to contribute to government policies. For this reason, I can say that ISIL has been defeated, but controlling money and transforming itself to a sleeping cell. And I can say that we may come across to ISIL in many parts of the world because the sociological background, especially in the Middle East, is very fertile to create new ISILs in the area.
John, last December, President Trump decided that he would withdraw, or he declared victory over ISIS, and he did withdraw some U.S. troops from Syria, as well as reducing support for Syrian Kurds. Was that a little bit premature? Did that give ISIL a chance to regroup?
Well, if we really look at the Islamic State story accurately, it goes back to the Bush administration's war to oust Saddam Hussein's regime. The forces that were constituted after the breakup of the Republican Guard that were allowed to flee into northern Iraq became the root of the Islamic State. They were largely defeated under David Petraeus' surge campaign, and then President Obama, I think, prematurely withdrew forces from Iraq that allowed the current version of Islamic State to form. President Trump had vowed to defeat them, and as your prior panelist just mentioned, militarily as a so-called state, they've been defeated in terms of their territorial control, but they've now effectively reconstituted as the terrorist organization they were when they first formed in northern Iraq and in Syria a decade ago. They're going to be a long-term problem for the region, and we're talking here about territory that constitutes the equivalent size of West Virginia in the United States that's being fought over by Islamic State, by Turkey, by Russia, by Iran, by the Kurdish forces there, and the United States with some support from troops in the area and that of the UK and France. But this really needs to be a determined international effort, not only to destroy Islamic State and whatever remnants are there, but to go on the offensive against the ideology that fuels Islamic State, has many thousands of supporters among the people in the refugee camps in the area there and the former controlled areas, as well as now parts in Northern Africa, Southwest Asia, as far east as the Philippines.
Majid Ghali, what is the status of the Kurds in Syria? We've seen, as I just mentioned, President Trump has reduced support to the Kurds. So what is their status right now?
Yeah, I was just talking to someone from there on the ground. The Kurds, they're witnessing a ticking time bomb, as that person told me, which is the United States, after rejecting that plan for 3 years, just agreed to a Turkish plan to start what they call a safe zone. That zone, I think everybody agrees, even at State Department and at Pentagon, will not be safe, and that zone will not last because, according to the plan, it will be there will be hundreds or even thousands of so-called opposition, Syrian opposition fighters will be brought to that area, and the Kurds who are being very essential in fighting ISIS will be kicked out of that area. And this will create a situation where these, as you know, the history of Syrian opposition groups and militias, they have a long record of either giving up areas to ISIS or joining them. So the Kurds there are seeing what they call, I think rightly described as a ticking time bomb. And it's happening right now. And the plan is, according to the U.S. officials and Turkish officials, will be implemented very soon, very fast, and the outcome of that will be basically more opportunities for ISIS, for its estimated, and let me remind everybody and your guests that those 18,000 fighters, that are a rough conservative estimate of the ISIS fighters and sympathizers in both Iraq and Syria.
Ambassador Mousavian, as we've just heard, looking at the situation in Syria right now, of course, President Trump has withdrawn some U.S. troops, has reduced support for the Kurds, and as we've just heard from our other guests, ISIS may have been defeated militarily, but it still has a strong and powerful presence in the region. And as John just told us, this is a fight not just against an insurgent force, it's also a fight against an ideology. So how is this going to be resolved?
I fully agree. ISIS is not a military group only. ISIS is an ideology, and this has not been created in 2, 3, 4 years. The sources who funded this ideology, everyone knows ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, Al-Nusra, they are coming from, all of them, they are coming from one source of ideology, which is Wahhabism, the motherland in Saudi Arabia. And it is documented that during 40, 50, 60 years, tens of billions of dollars have been invested by Saudi Arabia to educate this ideology all the world, in Middle East, Africa, everywhere. Therefore, we are facing with an ideology with hundreds of thousands of followers all over the world. If we are going to address this problem, this is priority number one. If any country can play a major role, that would be U.S., because the source is coming from the U.S. allies in the region.
Right.
The second issue is about the source of money, weapon, ISIS they have been receiving during the wars in Syria and Iraq and elsewhere. I don't believe the sources have been closed. The sources continue to support ISIS. The issue is the period.
And who are these
ISIS
sources, Ambassador?
It is well known, it is documented, it is coming from sometimes from Qatar, Emirates, Saudi Arabia, now still those countries with Wahhabism.
Okay.
Either the government or the persons are privates, they are behind. This is well known, well documented.
All right,
I don't need to say, however.
Let me put that to John.
Yep,
John, the ambassador was talking about U.S. allies there, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the Emirates. Is it time for the United States to start talking to these countries about this issue?
Well, we do know that the Saudis had begun to push billions of dollars around the world to promote madrasas and mosques that advance the very puritanical sect of Wahhabism in central Saudi Arabia, throughout the Middle East, in South Asia, and across Northern Africa. But much of this was in response to the Shia theocratic revolution in Iran. And so you have this larger contest for supremacy in the Middle East between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and it's playing out in proxy wars throughout the region. But it's no doubt that we've had this Wahhabist attack on the Assad forces going back to the beginning of the civil war in Syria that was largely fueled by money coming in from those countries in the Arabian Peninsula in order to overthrow the Assad regime.
All right, Ambassador, what do you make of that? Is this perhaps a Saudi response to Iranian ambitions in the region?
No, I believe, John, this is not true. Look at all terrorist activities ISIS did in Europe and the US. It had nothing to do with Shia. We don't have Shia government neither in European countries nor in the US. And when ISIS started to occupy the Iraqi land, they occupied Sunni part of Iraq, not Shia part of Iraq. And ISIS have killed more Sunni than Shia. If you go to the figures, they have killed more Sunni than Shia. Therefore, this is not really something about Shia and Iran. We know Sunnis, we have Malikis, Shafis, Hanafis.
Right.
They are all against Wahhabism. It is just it is not Sunni school of thought.
Yeah.
Overwhelming majority of world of Sunni, they are against ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Wahhabism.
Yeah.
It is not really about Shia Sunni.
All right, let me go back to Yusuf in Ankara. And Yusuf, what are your thoughts on how this can be resolved?
I totally agree with Musawiyan that it is not a Sunni school of teaching, because as a Sunni, which I am living in Turkey, which is more than 80 million people, is a Sunni schools educated, but it is purely a Wahhabi ideological issue. So, but I want to say that that's true. That is the ideology of a Wahhabism, and that is the reason I said in the first part of my talk that the sociological background is very good for creating such kind of terrorist groups. But what I can say that other issues such as poverty, injustice, war-torn countries, and one of the most important issues is that the failed states, because of those background, that any intelligence service, any country may provide lots of logistical support to those groups in accordance with their interest about the region.
Majid Gli, there are efforts underway to find some kind of solution. One is the creation of a demilitarized zone in Syria. Do you think that will work?
Absolutely not. Those are not solutions. They just changed the name from demilitarized zone, whether they call it safe zone. The solution is way more, as your guest mentioned, some of them is way more complicated. And I totally disagree that it's just about ideology or Wahhabism. It's also about the situation on the ground. Anan, I was there in 2014, just 2 months before ISIS took over of Mosul, Iraq's largest city. I saw, when I was reporting there on my own eyes, what happened in Iraq, what was the main factors. The first factor is the Sunni community in Iraq felt they were discriminated against, they were left out of governance process, decision-making process by the Shiite elite, which are supported by Iran. There's not just pinpoint one country in the region, there's different factors. Right now, as we speak, in Iraq, in those liberated areas from ISIS, especially the city of Kirkuk, which is a largely historically Sunni city, the moderate Sunnis, whether they are Kurds or Arabs, are the political parties or the refugees are being hindered, put obstacle on their way to be back to those areas, to Kirkuk,
right,
and around Kirkuk in Mosul. What does that mean? Who remains there? Usually poor people who are vulnerable to get radicalized by ISIS, which is already happening. Right now there are reports that ISIS recruiting in Kirkuk, around Mosul, and the reason is the Sunnis in Iraq, whether they are Kurds or Arab, they feel they are marginalized.
Okay. John, this is such a complex situation, and it seems here in Washington, of course, the United States has a stake here. It seems here in Washington that the United States, this is translated into some kind of confusion. We've got that Pentagon report, which says that, and I'm quoting here, ISIS has solidified its insurgent capabilities in Iraq and is resurging in Syria. Now, the Defense Secretary, Mark Esper, says ISIS is not resurgent in Syria. And this is what the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, had to say. Let's watch this.
It's complicated. There's certainly places where ISIS is more powerful today than they were 3 or 4 years ago. But the caliphate is gone, and their capacity to conduct external attacks has been made much more difficult. We've taken down significant risk. Not all of it, but a significant amount. And we're very pleased with the work that we've done.
These cabinet members must be getting the same intelligence, right?
They are, but it's all a matter of how you interpret the intelligence and what the baseline you're comparing it against is, so that it was a far more dangerous situation 3 or 4 years ago. And now you're seeing a slight ramping up of, say, Air Force sorties. I think they've doubled over the last 2-3 months, but they're far fewer than they were a year ago, a year and a half ago. But there's a couple of issues, Anand, that I want to bring to the table also. Yeah. I don't know that there's a clear U.S. stake here. There are stakes certainly involved for the governments in Syria, in Iraq, in Iran, and Turkey. Russia is playing a very important role here in crushing Islamic State to try to uphold the power of the Assad regime. The United States wanted to make sure that the Islamic State is not able to undertake any types of attacks against the U.S. or our key allies. The physical territory of the caliphate has been eliminated. But now we're dealing with a terrorist group just the way we're fighting al-Nusra, we're fighting al-Qaeda. These terrorist organizations are not going away anytime soon, including the Taliban in Afghanistan, with whom we're now negotiating a possible withdrawal of U.S. military forces. And long-term, there's a very dangerous element here. There's a very dangerous element because in the refugee camps where many of the ISIS fighters are located, parallel to that are about 70,000 women and children. 20,000 children under the age of 5 have been born in the caliphate. Have they already been radicalized? And are we dealing now with a multi-generational problem because of ideology overlaid over a political agenda that Islamic State and its founders and its supporters have undertaken in the Middle East. So this is going to be a long-term strategic issue for the region, and the U.S. will decide how it works with partners and with allies to try to most effectively deal with this very long-term problem.
Right. When I say U.S. stake, John, hasn't the U.S. consistently told us that when it comes to the fight against terrorism, we were going to have to fight them there rather than here?
Well, to a certain degree, yes, but it can't just be a military campaign. I mean, you can't just defeat terrorists by destroying physically the terrorists themselves because they keep popping up. It's a perennial whack-a-mole situation.
Ideological.
You have to also fight the ideology and also the political motivations of the terrorists who exploit religion, who exploit this particular Wahhabist sect in order to achieve political goals of regaining power that they lost in 2003 in the Middle East.
Right. Okay, Majid, go ahead.
Yes, I just wanted to point out what Secretary Pompeo and President Trump are saying is simply not true. ISIS is not defeated. The caliphate is not defeated. It's true they don't control big cities and towns, but ISIS is restructuring itself from a regional problem as a terrorist organization into a global issue. That, according to the United Nations, that bases its report on intelligence community all around the world, and according to, just you mentioned, according to a U.S. intelligence report, ISIS is restructuring with a lot of money, thousands of fighters. Right now, the fight, what the U.S. and the coalition in Syria and in Iraq is doing right now, is not a fight to defeat ISIS, but a hope to try to contain ISIS, which is right now is increasingly there are incidents that's failing in both Syria and Iraq.
Okay. Yusuf Al-Abada, to John's point about the U.S. stake in the region, the U.S. involvement in the region, President Trump has himself expressed frustration at the U.S. involvement in Syria and in Iraq. And this is what he had to say. Let's listen to this.
At a certain point, Russia, Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, Turkey, they're going to have to fight their battles too, okay? We wiped out the caliphate 100%. I did it in record time. But at a certain point, all of these other countries where ISIS is around, they've been decimated, by the way, badly decimated. But all of these countries are going to have to fight them. Because do we want to stay there for another 19 years? I don't think so.
So, Yusuf, does President Trump have a point there? The United States, as he points out, is 7,000 miles away. Is this a U.S. fight, or is this a fight in which the countries in the region have to step up?
I do believe that the countries who is surrounding that problem has to step up. So for this issue, I agree with Donald Trump that those countries should step up in order to limit the terrorist activities. But what I will say, I also has listened to Mr. John, which also underlined a couple of issues that the exclusion of the Sunnis inside Iraq also created the problem. The similar fact is also valid for the Syrian part. We know that a Nusayri regime also encircled, excluded all the Sunni inside the Syria, and now in the Idlib area there is a huge air bombings from the Russia to the Idlib area, which is living more than 4 million people without any discrimination, children, schools, hospitals, mosques, etc. For this reason, you are radicalizing people by this kind of bombing. For this issue, Russia, Turkey, Iran, they should fight against the ISIS, as Mr. Trump said. For this reason, I can give an example that Turkey is the only country fought against ISIS issues, elements with his soldiers alongside his borders. So every country should contribute, not only militarily, but also in terms of drying the back problems inside the Syria and Iraq, such in the case of poverty, war, violence, injustice against the Sunnis.
Okay, John?
Referencing the President Trump clip that you just showed, Anand, let's also keep in mind that those of us who are following the Democratic Party primary process here in the United States will note that not a single Democratic candidate is for prolonging this military situation in Syria or against Islamic State more broadly. So right now, going into the 2020 presidential race, if President Trump wins, we'll have a sense of continuity there, however they decide to finally formulate a policy. But if a Democrat wins in 2020, there's not going to be any significant change from what we see under President Trump. The U.S. wants to pull back from Syria and from Iraq. The American voters want an end to these endless wars, whether it's in the Middle East, whether it's in Afghanistan. And I don't think there's going to be any change in voter sentiment after 2020. And the countries that have a stake, a direct stake, not only in the Middle East, but also Europe. Europe had a weaponized refugee crisis 4 or 5 years ago that completely upended European domestic politics. Where are the Europeans to step up to the plate and work with Middle Eastern partners to try to address this terrorism issue that affects their political systems and affects the safety and security of their own citizens? As one of your panelists noted, there have been a series of terrorist attacks in Europe over the years.
All right, Ambassador Mousavian, go ahead.
Yes, first of all, if there is going to be a real fight and war on ISIS and other similar terrorist groups, there should be a collective cooperation between all regional powers in the region, whether this is Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and the international powers, whether this is Russia or the US or Europe. As long as we don't have a collective real cooperation, we are not going to achieve anything.
Okay, and we are going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.
A land full of natural resources and ingenuity, where millions are embracing a vibrant middle class. Divided by politics, but united by hope. Latin America is changing rapidly. Witness the change on America's Now.
Whether it's about your education, the home you live in, or the items you buy, your money has a story to tell. Because every business story is a human story. Global Business.